Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 8 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 2, Chapter 4, Conflicting Jurisdictions, Part 8. It was not the secular courts alone that had these perpetual conflicts with the Inquisition. Like Ishmael, its hand was against every man, and every man's hand was against it. But in fact, this was to a great extent the case between all the different jurisdictions among which the various classes of society were parceled out by their several privileges and exemptions. Next to the royal courts ranked the spiritual courts, in the numbers and complexity of debatable questions with the Inquisition. With these there were two sources of contention, for they not only claimed by prescriptive right exclusive jurisdiction in all temporal matters over all who wore the tonsure, but there was a broad field for discussion in the somewhat hazy delimitation of spiritual offenses justiciable by one or the other. The latter subject will engage our attention hereafter. At present, we are concerned only with the questions arising from the personnel of the Holy Office. Notoriously lax, as were the episcopal courts, with offenders of the cloth, the Inquisition had the reputation of still greater indulgence with those who were under its protection. Clerics who were also officials therefore preferred its tribunals, giving rise to frequent quarrels in which the inquisitors treated their clerical opponents as remorselessly as they did the secular officials and judges. The episcopal ordinaries, provisors, and vicars-generals contended that they had, except in cases of faith, exclusive jurisdiction over all clerics, that the temporal jurisdiction of the Inquisition was a royal grant which could not supersede the canon law, and that the papal commissions only gave faculties for punishing official malfeasance. To this unanswerable argument the inquisitors paid little heed, and the prelates were worse off than the judges, for these at least had the councils of Castile or Aragon to struggle for them, but the councils admitted that they had no standing in ecclesiastical quarrels. The natural recourse of the prelates for protection was to Rome, but this was a subject of intense jealousy, traditional in the Spanish monarchy, and Philip III, in a cedula of January 21, 1611, addressed to all the prelates of his dominions, told them that they must appeal only to the Suprema, and forbade them to carry on any case to the Holy See. There could thus be no competencia. The conflicts between the two jurisdictions were one-sided, and were conducted by the tribunals with the same overbearing arrogance as that displayed toward the secular magistrates. The first summons on the provisor or vicar-general inhibited him, under pain of excommunication and a heavy fine, from further action, ordering him within 24 hours to remit the case to the Inquisition and to discharge the prisoner under bail to present himself before the tribunal, while the notary was required to surrender all the papers. If this was not obeyed, it was followed by another, commanding obedience within 6 hours, in default of which all beneficed priests were required, under similar penalties, to publish the provisor and notary as excommunicates, and to place their names on the list as such. A circular letter was also addressed to all priests, chaplains, and sacristans of the district, to admonish all persons within 6 hours and under pain of excommunication to avoid the provisor and notary, to make no pleadings before him, to hold no communication with them, and not to furnish them with bread or wine, fish or flesh, while a public edict to the same effect was issued to all the people. In case of continued obduracy, these measures were promptly followed by an edict to all the clergy, ordering them to anathematize the provisor and notary with tolling bells and extinguished candles, proclaiming them accursed of God and his saints. Quote, "Accursed be the bread that they eat, and the bed on which they sleep, and the beasts on which they ride, and may their souls perish in hell like the candles in the water. Let them be comprehended in the sentences of Sodom and Gomorrah, and of Dathan and Abiram, whom the earth swallowed for disobedience, and may all the curses of Psalm Deus laudum meum light on them." Unquote. If this did not suffice, within 24 hours, an interdict followed, tolling bells and performing divine service in low tone with locked doors until otherwise ordered. In case this failed, the last step was a cessatio a divinis, or a cessation of church services in the city where the offenders lived, in order to coerce them with popular clamor. It was difficult for either lay or clergy officials to contend with opponents who wielded such weapons as these. The irresponsible exercise of such powers inevitably led to their abuse. In the Concordia of 1568, it is highly suggestive to find a clause forbidding inquisitors to issue, as they have been accustomed, to familiars and officials, general inhibitions protecting them from the ecclesiastical courts. Such inhibitions are to be special and issued only in each case as it may occur. Equally significant is another which says that in no case belonging to the law to the provisor shall the inquisitor intervene against his will. The strained relations resulting between the ecclesiastical body and the Holy Office are alluded to in the project of reform presented to the Suprema in 1623, which says that the clergy commissioners and their notaries bring about many conflicts with the ecclesiastical judges, and, as there are no concordias, the inquisitors are wont to arrogate to themselves greater jurisdiction than belongs to them, which causes much murmuring and resentment of the prelates and clergy. The writer piously wishes that this could be avoided, but he evidently has no remedy to propose. A conflict caused by one of these local notaries in 1609 amply justified the murmurs of the prelates. The priest of Cabra, who occupied the almost nominal position of local notary, was a notorious incestuous concubinarian who had not for 8 years celebrated Mass or recited prayers. The provisor of Cordova commenced a prosecution and threw him into the episcopal jail when he claimed the fuero of the Inquisition. The provisor had been on friendly terms with the 3 inquisitors and sought an amicable settlement of the matter when, by a trick, they obtained possession of the papers and inhibited him from further proceedings. He appealed to the Suprema and was excommunicated. 4 times the Suprema ordered the inquisitors to abandon the case and remove the censure, but they persistently disobeyed. All the officials of the episcopal court were ordered to hold no communication with him, which threw the whole business of the diocese into confusion, for the bishop was absent, and the provisor was his representative. The culprit escaped from the episcopal jail and was harbored by the tribunal. Passion was becoming acute. A band of familiars and officials broke into the episcopal palace and endeavored to carry off the provisor, but he was rescued by the canons in a dilapidated condition and took to his bed. Then the inquisitors pronounced the magic word, a matter of faith, which brought to their aid the corregidor and municipal authorities, who came with a troop of soldiers and carried him off to his bed to the sound of drums and trumpets. He was taken to the Inquisition and confined for 2 months in a small cell, tried without opportunity for defense, and sentenced to forfeit his office of provisor, to 4 years of banishment and other penalties, and copies of the sentence were circulated throughout the city. The bishop had sought to come to his rescue by excommunicating the inquisitors. They disregarded the censures, threatened to prosecute him if he did not remove them, and did prosecute some of the canons as conspiring against the Inquisition, because they had been elected by the chapter to aid the bishop in defending the provisor. Such a sentence against a church dignitary of high rank required confirmation by the Suprema, which must have been given, for appeal was made to Philip III. He rendered some satisfaction by dismissing and banishing all secular officials who had been concerned in the arrest and wounding of the provisor by the inquisitors, whose mere tools they had been, were left undisturbed. Yet it was impossible that an affair which had aroused the attention of all Spain should pass without an attempt to prevent the recurrence of such scandals. There had been a threat, and possibly more than a threat, to appeal to Rome in defense of the bishop and clergy of Cordova, which led to the cedula of January 21, 1611, alluded to above, restricting their recourse to the Suprema. In urging this, the Suprema, in a consulta of November 15, 1610, admitted that these troubles arose from the aggressions of the tribunals and their unnecessary multiplication of nominal officials. It had recently issued 3 cartas acordadas on the subject and had written to all the bishops asking reports of such excess so as to remedy them. Philip, in reply, authorized the Suprema to draft such a cedula as it desired, but ordered it to be so framed as not to encourage the inquisitors, who were every day intervening in matters beyond their competence for the purpose of extending their jurisdiction. It was this that gave rise to these troubles, nor would they cease till the cause was removed. Thus it was admitted on all hands that the fault lay with the tribunals, yet the wrong committed by that of Cordova remained unredressed and unpunished. Philip permitted himself, in spite of his better judgment, to be persuaded to cut off all recourse to the court of last resort in Rome, and some nominal relief must be offered to the oppressed churches and prelates. The memorial from Cordova had concluded with a prayer for some law to prevent these discords and to maintain the episcopal jurisdiction over the clergy, as the king had promised in a letter transmitted through the Council of Castile. The promise was kept after a fashion, though not until after a delay, which shows how prolonged was the resistance encouraged. In a carta acordada of November 28, 1612, the tribunals were informed that, in order that the ministers of the Inquisition may not sin through confidence of impunity, and to prevent the conflicts which disturb the peace, the Suprema has resolved that in the cases of unsalaried clerical officials, the episcopal ordinaries shall have exclusive jurisdiction over offences relating to clerical duties and offices, to simony and spiritual matters, while inquisitors shall have cumulative jurisdiction with the ordinaries, depending on priority of action in public and scandalous offences, such as incontinence, usury, gambling, and the like. This remained in force, nominally at least, until the last, but the allusion to the perpetual troubles arising from this source in the project presented to the Suprema in 1623 shows how futile it was in curbing the aggressions of the tribunals. Throughout peninsular Spain, the episcopal jurisdiction was thus left defenseless to the encroachments of the Inquisition, but the Church of Majorca was fortunate in obtaining the protection of Rome, leading to a series of conflicts, waged on less unequal terms, which are worth consideration as revealing a peculiar phase in these affairs. There was a long-standing quarrel between the cathedral canons and the Inquisition. In 1600, one of the former, Père Enseñat, assisted in the escape of a man who had wounded a familiar, whereupon the inquisitor, Francisco de Esquinay, threw him in prison and made him give bail in 300 ducats. In 1605, another canon, Francisco Sanceloni, had a verbal altercation with Bernardo Luis Cotoner, advocate of prisoners, for which Esquinay imprisoned him, tried him and condemned him in the costs with this past incarceration as a punishment. The indignant canons addressed a strong demonstration to the Suprema. They had an old privilege confirmed by the Council of Trent that they could be arrested only by the ordinary sitting in judgment with 2 of their number. In matters of faith they admitted subjection to the Holy Office, but they claimed exemption in civil and criminal cases. The number of familiars and officials, and their petulance arising from the protection of the tribunal, rendered it impossible to be always incurring the expense and dangers of appeals to Rome for the preservation of their privileges. This was ineffective, and, in the course of another outbreak in 1630, there was a correspondence between the Congregation of the Roman Inquisition and the nuncio at Madrid respecting an appeal from the canons. In this, the nuncio reported that he had applied to Inquisitor-General Zapata, who promised to instruct the inquisitor not to molest the canons. If he did so, he was disobeyed, as usual, and, In 1636, a canon named Domenge was involved in a civil suit before the tribunal, resulting in a judgment against him of 5,000 reales, the execution of which he resisted by force. This brought on him a prosecution, in spite of protests interjected by the bishop and chapter, which was carried on appeal to the Suprema, where he was condemned in 700 reales, which he paid. Meanwhile, notwithstanding the cedula of 1611, the bishop and chapter had appealed to Rome for a brief declaration that the canons were subject to the Inquisition only in matters of faith. The question was exhaustively discussed in the Congregation of the Holy Office, with Luis de los Infantes, the Roman agent of the Inquisition. The conclusion reached was that the Mallorca tribunal had no jurisdiction over the canons save in matters of faith, and this was duly embodied in the brief Cum Sicut Delecti, March 31, 1642, which is preserved in the Bellarium. It names the bishop and dean or treasurer as executors, with power to inflict censures and to invoke, if necessary, the aid of the secular arm. It was received in Mallorca with general rejoicing. It was printed and circulated, and a syndicate was formed by the clergy to obtain, without regard to expense, a similar one for the whole ecclesiastical body, an effort which was successful in the following September. The brief was duly served on the inquisitor, who refused to recognize it as not having been transmitted through the Suprema. Besides, he asserted that it was surreptitious and obreptitious, as having been granted without a hearing of the other side, and moreover, it was in derogation of the bull Si de Protegendis. In a consulta of December 11th, the Suprema represented energetically to Philip IV the manner in which his predecessors had compelled the surrender of papal letters adverse to the Inquisition. It asked him to have the present one suppressed and to instruct the prelates that all cases of difference must be referred to it, that no recourse he had to Rome under the penalties decreed by Ferdinand, that the Viceroy of Mallorca be required to compel the chapter to desist, and that the ambassador to Rome be instructed to obtain the revocation of the obnoxious letters. Unluckily for the Suprema, the times were unpropitious. Mallorca was too near to rebellious Catalonia for the imperious methods of the Holy Office to be judicious. Philip replied that the revival of Ferdinand's laws would cause trouble, and the remedies sought must be practicable. The Inquisitor of Mallorca had been guilty of gross excesses, and must be ordered to exercise moderation, and he suggested a junta of members of the Suprema and Council of Aragon to devise a concordia. Whether such compromise was reached does not appear. If it was, subsequent events show that it was not observed by either side, and no reference to it occurs. The papal briefs were maintained, and 10 years later, after the collapse of the Catalan rebellion, instructions of April 23, 1652, to an ambassador departing for Rome, order him to labor for their revocation. Their evil example was contagious. The Knights of St. John in Mallorca were seeking to obtain a similar favor through the Maltese ambassador, which must be resisted in every way, for it would be followed by all of the other orders. The Suprema continued to treat the papal briefs as surreptitious, and, in 1658, Arce y Reynoso enjoyed a momentary triumph in a contest by summoning the Vicar General to Madrid and forcing him to come. Under the feebler government of the Queen Regent, his successor Neithard was not so fortunate. In a fierce quarrel which involved the whole island in confusion and embroiled the rival departments of the government. May 9, 1667, on a feast day, in the church of San Francisco, Don Jorge de Meto struck his son-in-law, Don José Vallejo, with a crutch, causing infusion of blood and thus polluting the church. Both gentlemen were familiars. The inquisitor, before noonday, ordered the arrest of both. In the afternoon, Bishop Manjarre cited de Meto to appear for sacrilege and violation of the church. The rival jurisdictions locked horns and proceeded to extremities. The viceroy and audiencia, with the bulk of the community, sided with the bishop. But disturbances were commencing, and they repeatedly urged postponement of action until the government could be heard from, but the inquisitor refused. The bishop published him as excommunicate, anathematized him, and caused a psalm of malediction to be repeatedly sung against him, but the inquisitor continued to celebrate Mass, exhibited himself conspicuously in public, forbade the bishop entrance into his own church, and threatened to suspend his sacerdotal functions. On August 29, the bishop assembled a synod, where arrangements were made to send an envoy to Rome to prosecute the case, with a printed statement of all the proceedings, a copy of which was furnished to the Council of Aragon. From Madrid, Nithard imperiously summoned the bishop to appear before him and plead his case. Under the canon law, the Inquisition had no jurisdiction over bishops, without a special delegation of papal faculties, and Manjarre was justified in declaring the summon null and void. Although an ecclesiastical question, the Council of Aragon had no direct competence. Still, as the peace of Majorca was seriously threatened and the viceroy was involved, it took a hand in the matter, and thus were presented the gravest questions with regard to the relations of the Inquisition with the episcopate, with the Holy See, and with the secular authorities. Secured in the blind obedience of the Queen, Nithard adopted the most aggressive attitude, and the Queen submissively did whatever he required, for he assured her that the case was the most serious that had arisen since the foundation of the Inquisition, and that, on its rightful decision, depended the preservation or extinction not alone of the Majorca Tribunal, but of all of those under the Crown of Aragon. To emphasize this, he summoned the bishop to appear before him, personally or by procurator, within a term designated, in default of which he would be prosecuted in contumacia. To this the Queen, in October, added her commands to the Council of Aragon. As the preservation of the Catholic faith required the maintenance of the authority of the Inquisition, the Council was ordered to write to the bishop to comply with the summons, and to the viceroy to assist the tribunal if necessary. The bishop must not appeal to Rome, and if he had done so, the letters must be intercepted and placed in her hands. The Council of Aragon did not obey. It held the matter until January 21, 1668, when it presented a consulta warning the Queen of the consequences of her action and pointing out that the Pope was the sole judge of bishops in important cases, as were provincial synods in trivial matters. Nithard, however, was superior to the Council of Trent, and the Suprema commenced a criminal prosecution of Bishop Manjarre, while, on February 5, an answer was prepared for the Council of Aragon, couched in a tone of bitterness and scarcely veiled contempt, which showed how fierce were the passions at work. The Queen was assured that her actions were in accordance with all previous royal provisions, and she was asked to order the Council of Aragon to obey and not to interfere hereafter with ecclesiastical controversies. Before this missive was delivered, however, news came from Majorca that the culprit Demeto had withdrawn his appeal to the tribunal and had applied for absolution to the bishop, who considered the whole matter as settled. This was a staggering blow from which it took Nithard a month to recover. But finally he sent the consulta of February 5 with a postscript of March 12, arguing that the subject cannot impair his judge's jurisdiction by accepting another, and consequently that the situation was unaltered. The Queen, of course, adopted this view and repeated her orders. But again the council disobeyed her and presented, March 18th, a consulta adjuring her in solemn terms to reflect calmly, for she was making the Inquisitor-General a judge of all the bishops in her dominions, not only as to conflicts of jurisdiction but also as to criminal accusations, without his holding faculties from the Pope, while, at the same time, she was forbidding appeals to the Holy See, which was the only proper judge. She was warned that it was impossible to exaggerate the importance of the questions at issue, and she was implored, before making so momentous a decision, to consult the councils of Castile, Italy, and the Indies, for the interest of the whole monarchy were involved, as well as the supreme power of the Pope. To this her reply was merely a repetition of her former orders, and a demand for a duplicate of the letters of the council to the viceroy. For the third time it disobeyed her. and sent none, and there are intimations that it was engaged in arousing the whole Spanish episcopate to a sense of the impending danger. End of Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 8.